Hello, everyone. We're going to look at the Enlightenment era this week. And this lecture actually will be really short because most of it's just based on the activity, on the excerpt readings from, they're from the book, but I scanned them and put them on Canvas for you. And you'll analyze some of these different thinkers. Okay, so let's get started. Before we get into the Enlightenment era, I quickly want to talk about what's happening in Europe at this time. Hopefully you read about the scientific revolution and how that begins to transform society, where science becomes this rational way to look at the world, right? Where it's definitely moving away from that medieval concept of the supernatural, and people are recognizing how science is much more logical in order to explain things. In addition, science provides this way for people to make money, and the scientific knowledge is creating new tools. So science begins to surpass these kind of religious beliefs, or at least this fear that they had of scientific work. So definitely science begins to triumph over religion in certain parts of life, not everybody. And I want to talk quickly about Rene Descartes. So you probably know him from his one expression of "I think, therefore I am." And he's important because he kind of introduces the scientific method to Western society. This notion that you go through this procedure in order to test things, in order to understand them, right, and not just be guessing or having an opinion, or again looking at the supernatural for answers. So one of his kind of major arguments is that he only accepts what reason assumes to be true, right? So just because you're told something doesn't make it true. A lot of times they're kind of debating religion because, again, it's a very top-down approach, whereas these people are trying to think of things logically. And he is known as the father of modern rationalism. So he's doing a lot of things. He's a man. He's definitely a Renaissance man, coming up with different things in mathematics, and again, scientific method, and then philosophy at this time. And he kind of gives birth to this era, the Enlightenment era. So the Enlightenment era is definitely influenced by the scientific knowledge of this time, where science, again, it's a functioning tool that explains how the world works. So if you read about Galileo or Copernicus and all these other people, they use math, right? They use a scientific approach to address questions that they have, and it's just not some random entity living in space controlling or pulling the strings. And they really begin to argue that there's order in the universe. The salons are very important. The reading talks about the salons, right? The salons are there so people can gather together. People can basically meet at almost like a social club and talk about some of their work, kind of like a book club, but with drinking. And this is a way to kind of spread this knowledge. Now, this is a very exclusive club too. Most people, particularly average people, even if they're educated, would not be allowed to enter these spaces. It was invitation only, and it was mostly the best known scholars. So how does science play an important role? Well, one of them is Bernard de Fontenelle. Again, he's in your book, and they talk about him, of how he had this very deep scientific knowledge, right? And he was able to kind of dumb it down for the rest of us to read, particularly the Enlightenment thinkers of this era, where they might have been smart, but they just don't understand science, right? The language is just maybe a little bit too difficult for them. So Bernard de Fontenelle was your Wikipedia of the 17th century at this time, 18th century. So he becomes very instrumental because he's able to digest a lot of this scientific knowledge and make it accessible to the Enlightenment thinkers. Another element of the Enlightenment era is this sense of skepticism, right? Don't just believe what you're told, but think about it, be critical of it. And you'll see that as you look at Rousseau and Diderot and Montesquieu, and how they're very skeptical of things that have come before them, and people just seem to accept them as, well, that's just the way things are. Another important person to the Enlightenment era, somebody who influences the Enlightenment era, is Newton. Newton created the sense of order in the universe, right? The universe, by looking at his different laws of gravity and so forth, kind of creates this universe that is ordered. It's not a random system, but rather there are laws that govern it. And in particular, there's natural laws that govern it. And that's what makes them very important. So they believe in God, this concept of deism, but they believe that God created these rules and let them kind of govern. And that's what Newton kind of tapped into. And the Enlightenment era felt that they can replicate it, obviously not with science, but with human beings, right? That there's certain laws that govern us that we have forgotten about because of religion. So many of them begin to reject religion and try to find these natural laws. And I think Diderot is one of the best examples of that. And the last example I want to talk about, and again, this kind of refers to Diderot too, is this concept of the noble savage, where they look at non-Western cultures as much more civilized than Europeans at this time, which is kind of odd, right? Because typically the other way around, where Europeans saw themselves as more civilized. However, they argue that the noble savage, so they're still a little bit racist, but they say that the noble savage has not been corrupted by Western culture, Western beliefs, religion, and that they're following the laws of nature to govern their society. So again, you'll see that with Diderot in his excerpt. So they're advocating for this notion of cultural relativism, that there is not one supreme society, but rather every society is relative, right? Every society, and quite the opposite, they do kind of believe that non-Western societies are superior to Western society. So the next activity will kind of focus on the idea of these readings, and again, the assignments is posted, and read the instructions before you post, and answer the questions, and make sure to respond to your classmates too.